and welcome to Backpacker Flip-Flops. I am your host, Joanne Hendrickson. This podcast is about my travels and experiences to different cities and countries around the world. My goal is to help travelers see and engage in places in a whole new way. Please check out my website, backpackerflipflops.com, or follow me on Instagram at backpackerflipflops. Each month, this podcast will support a different charity or organization. For the month of April, for each subscriber and 5-star review received, I'll be donating $1 to the Boston Public Library. My friend Don is fundraising for the Boston Public Library as part of a Boston Marathon charity bib. The funds raised in this campaign will go towards enhancing and enriching the after-school youth programs, which, true to the library's mission, are always free to all. You can learn more about Don and the Boston Marathon fundraising journey supporting the Boston Public Library, or make a donation to them by visiting their link on my website, backpackerflipflops.com/giving-back. Movies are filled with some incredible love stories, and if you ask anyone who was a teenage girl back in the late 1990s who was the greatest love story of all time, most likely they will say Jack and Rose of the Titanic. How do I know this? Well, I was one of those girls who went crazy for Leonardo DiCaprio as well, wearing my fake Heart of the Ocean necklace, and watched the movie on my 2 VHS tapes more times than I can count. I remember the excitement that came around when it was found out that there was an actual J Dawson who was on the Titanic. Oh my God, was Jack real? I remember reading stories of large groups, mostly made of women, going to a cemetery in Nova Scotia to see the grave of J Dawson of the Titanic. Producers noted again that Jack Dawson was not based on a real character, and the fact that there was a passenger with a similar name was simply a coincidence. However, that did not stop the groups of women from making their way to Nova Scotia to see the grave of J Dawson. And in the summer of 2019, I became one of those girls fulfilling one of my teenage dreams. I was traveling to Nova Scotia to run a marathon and decided to add a few extra days to my trip for sightseeing, including finding the mysterious J Dawson's grave location, so my research began. The very first question I had was, why was this victim from the Titanic buried in Nova Scotia? And immediately, I got so many interesting answers. Specifically, J Dawson was buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia was the resting place to another 149 victims of the Titanic. To put a bit of this more into perspective, over 1,500 people died when the Titanic sank. Somewhere between 328 to 340 victims were found, or just about 1 out of every 5 victims. The number count varies a bit because of some sloppy record keeping and multiple ships making trips to find the victims. Of those found, 119, or just about 1 out of every 3 victims, was buried at sea. This happened because the bodies were either so damaged or decomposed, but it also happened because the first ship to arrive ran out of embalming supplies, and due to government rules, only embalmed bodies could be brought ashore. Class distinctions played a role on what happened to the bodies, and many who were thought to be third-class passengers were buried at sea, while first-class passengers were placed into coffins and second-class passengers were wrapped in canvas body bags. 209 bodies were brought to Halifax. Halifax was the closest major seaport that had rail connections. It became the base for ships searching for and recovering the bodies of the victims. 59 of the victims were claimed by family members and shipped home. The remaining 150 were buried in Halifax. 121 of these victims were laid to rest at the non-denominational Fairview Lawn Cemetery, including J Dawson. Another 19 were laid to rest at the Roman Catholic Mount Olivet Cemetery, and 10 were buried at the Jewish Baranze Hirsch Cemetery. The White Star Line Company paid for tombstones for all the victims buried in Halifax. The tombstones that they provided were identical to one another. While on the ship, there were distinct class differences. Inside the cemetery, they were all just victims. The tombstones say their name, if it's known, the same death date of April 15th, 1912, and a number. This number signifies the order which the body was found. In the cemetery are first, second, and third-class passengers, as well as some employees, such as stewards and elevator attendants. And looking at the graves for the most part, you would not know any information about the victims. The Catholic Mount Olivet Cemetery has 19 graves, 14 of which has victims that have been identified. They were determined to be Catholic based on personal effects found on the bodies. The Jewish Baranze Hirsch Cemetery has 10 victims buried who were thought to be Jewish, 8 of whom are unidentified. It was determined that they were Jewish by a local rabbi inspecting the bodies and identifying who he thought was Jewish. The rabbi planned for 18 of the bodies to be transported to the Jewish cemetery. However, he didn't have the authority to move them. 8 were buried, and then permission was granted for those 8 to stay buried, and 2 more were also granted permission to be buried there, but no other burials were permitted, so this cemetery holds 10 victims. The 2 identified victims that were buried, it turns out, are not Jewish. One was a steward who was a member of the Church of England. The other has a unique and more famous story. He was Michel Navratil, who had gotten a divorce earlier that year. His ex-wife had custody of their 2 children, but she allowed for them to go visit their father over Easter weekend. He fled from France with the children, first going to Monte Carlo and then traveled to England to board the Titanic and immigrate to the United States. He traveled under a fake name, Louis Hoffman, and also gave his children fake names. When the ship was sinking, he put both kids onto a lifeboat. As one of his children later said, his father said to him, "My child, when your mother comes for you, as she surely will, tell her that I loved her dearly and still do. Tell her I expected her to follow us, so that we may all live happily together in the peace and freedom of the new world." Michel died when the ship sank, and his children, traveling under fake names and only able to speak French, were soon known as the Titanic orphans. Their mother was finally identified thanks to a newspaper article, and she went to America to get them. After figuring out that Louis Hoffman, with a typical Jewish name, was actually Michel Navratil, not Jewish, he was still kept buried in the Jewish cemetery. The majority of victims, 121, however, are buried at Fairview Lawn Cemetery. The victims buried there are aged from 2 years old to 52 years old, from multiple countries, and tended to be male. They were arranged in 4 rows, and the rows have a gentle curve, making this group of graves look like a ship, but the design is not said to have been intentional. The number of graves in each row is uneven, as if they expected to be adding more graves. In addition to the mysterious J Dawson, there were several other interments that are very interesting. While I came to see one grave, there were 120 other stories in the Fairview Lawn Cemetery that I found myself wanting to learn more about. While most of the tombstones were identical, some were unique and paid for by victims' families or other individuals, and their stories started to come to life. The earliest body recovered from the cemetery was that of J.W. Marriott. He is not related to the famous Marriott family. His tombstone notes that he was the second body retrieved. That prompts the question, where is the tombstone for the first body? The first victim was identified to be Walter John Van Billard, a third-class passenger who was 9 years old and whose family paid for his body to be sent to Pennsylvania for burial. So J.W. Marriott is the earliest body retrieved, located in Nova Scotia. By comparison, the last recovered body is that of James McGrady, noted as body 330, and was found weeks after the ship sank and is also buried in this cemetery. There were some interesting and unique graves, like that of Arthur Gordon McCrae and Ernest Edward Samuel Freeman. The largest tombstone is a Celtic cross and was built for an Australian named Arthur Gordon McCrae. He was a second-class passenger who was well-traveled and on his way to Canada to visit some friends. His grave is also rare in that it does not have a body number listed on it, though research shows he was body number 209. And then there is Ernest Edward Samuel Freeman, noted as body 239. He has a unique tombstone, and his tombstone was actually erected by J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, for whom Freeman had been a secretary. The text reads, "He remained at his post of duty, seeking to save others regardless of his own life, and went down with the ship." Ismay privately also made arrangements for a personal pension to be paid to the Freeman's relatives. It's been said that Ismay felt a lot of guilt, particularly about Freeman's death, as he did all these extra actions to recognize him. There were graves for some victims whose remains were identified after their burial, such as Winla Marie Heinonen and Jenny Louisa Henriksen. Winla Marie Heinenen's name was found on the front of the tombstone and not on top, which signifies that she was identified after burial. On her sweater was the initials VH, and later it was determined that VH was actually WH, and attributed to her being from Finland for the different pronunciation. Jenny Louisa Henriksen stood out to me because of the similarity of our last names and our shared JH initials. She was the third victim found. She was later identified through the initials JH, which was on a piece of her clothing. She was the only passenger on the Titanic that had our initials. This really hit my heart. Winla and Jenny are only 2 of 4 women buried in the Titanic plot at Fairview Lawn Cemetery. There was also some heartbreaking stories, like that of Alma Paulson, one of the other women buried at Fairview Lawn Cemetery. She was from Sweden and was traveling to the United States where her husband was already living and working. He saved enough money to pay for her and their 4 children, aged 2 to 8 years old, to come over and join them. As the ship was sinking, Alma struggled to watch her 4 children and asked another individual who she got to know on the ship for help. But as the water came and approached them, he lost his grip on the 2 children and they disappeared into the water. Alma and her other 2 children also drowned. While Alma's body was recovered, her children's bodies never were. Her husband paid for them to have a special grave, noting Alma as 29 years old, body 206, died with her 4 children. There is a grave to someone who impacted our understanding of Titanic. That was Herbert Cave, body 218, and he also has a special tombstone. The fact his body was recovered has helped researchers later with an understanding of Titanic and her victims, as among the effects located on his body was a partial listing of first-class cabin accommodations and is the only known surviving record of such a document. There were also graves to heroes like William Denton Cox and John Law Hume. William Denton Cox was body 300, and his name is written on the front of the tombstone, so he was identified after burial. His grave blends in so much that unless if you were looking at the front and see his name, it would be easy to think of him just as another faceless victim. However, he is someone whose name should be known. While the ship was sinking, Cox was seen to be heroically leading groups of steerage passengers up to the boat deck, aided by other fellow third-class stewards. His actions possibly saved some lives, or at a minimum, help provide comfort to some in their final moments of life. And then there is John Law Hume, noted as body 193. Aside from Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On, there is one other song forever associated with the Titanic, and that is Nearer My God to Thee. It was played by the ship's orchestra as the ship sank and was famously portrayed in the movie Titanic. John Law Hume was one of the members of the orchestra, a violinist from Scotland. He was recruited to play on the maiden voyage due to his good reputation as a musician. He was only 21 when he died and was unaware that his fiancée was pregnant with his child. An interesting piece of trivia is that his family was sent a bill from the Musicians Union just 15 days after his death, requesting payment for the cost of his uniform. The bill went unpaid. And then there are 2 graves that especially stuck out, and that is the one for the unknown child and also one for J Dawson. There is a grave that looks different than any of the others, and it makes you pause. It reads, erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster of the Titanic, April 15, 1912. The unknown child was the 4th body located by the Mackia Bennett ship. The crew was so emotional by finding this young victim, they paid for the child's casket, tombstone, and even served at pallbearers for a funeral service. The remains of the child were tried to be identified. For a while, the baby was incorrectly identified as one of Anna Paulson's children, and also for a while was thought to be a baby from Finland. But in 2007, DNA testing, along with the type of shoes the child was wearing, led him to being identified as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old baby from England, who died along with his entire family, and was the only member of his family recovered and identified. A marker has been installed in front of the tombstone that looks like the other tombstones that the White Star Line provided. It reads his name, born September 9th, 1910, and has the same death date listed, and a 4, signifying it being the 4th body recovered. Visitors leave stuffed animals, teddy bears, and flowers on the grave. He's been a symbol of all the young victims from this experience. And of course, the grave that everyone comes to see, that of J Dawson. His name was Joseph, and his tombstone simply reads, J Dawson, died April 15th, 1912, 2:27. And yet this tombstone is so well known, even if it lacks a real connection to the fictional Jack Dawson. Joseph Dawson was definitely different than fictional Jack. Joseph was born in Dublin in 1888. He joined the British Army, and his military records note he was 5'7", weighed 144 pounds, had brown hair, and gray eyes. He had quite a few medical issues and had to have 5 teeth removed. His body was number 227 recovered. The notes about his body, when recovered, read as follows. Number 227, male, estimated age 30, hair light and mustache, clothing, dungaree coat and pants, gray shirt, no markings on body or clothing. Effects NS and S union, 35638. It is believed that Dawson knew the fate of the ship. Dressed in what would have been his uniform, even though he was off that night, that card was his identity, and it was signed J Dawson. He was not wearing shoes, and some have suggested perhaps he planned to try to swim when the boat sank. He worked in the boiler room on the Titanic and was responsible for channeling coal to the firemen at the furnace. He was Roman Catholic, but was not identified as one and not buried at the Catholic cemetery. Because his name was listed as J Dawson, if it had been written as Joseph, it would have suggested his Catholic upbringing. Since the movie, people have come out and left flowers, photos of Leonardo DiCaprio, movie memorabilia including their old ticket stubs, and also playing cards to signify that Jack Dawson, who had won his way onto the Titanic with a lucky hand in poker. It is clear he is the most visited grave. During my visit to the cemetery, every minute another female that was around my age came walking by and starting to look at the names. We all knew why one another was there, and would kindly tell one another, "Dawson is over there," and they immediately went over to see his. And then they too started looking at every other grave and pausing and reading. I'm confident we all left with a greater understanding of J Dawson and his fellow victims, and our former teenage hearts have changed how we view the passengers of the Titanic. Now when I hear about the Titanic, I do not think of Jack and Rose. I think of the names I got to know, like J.W. Marriott and James McGrady, Arthur Gordon McCrae and Ernest Edward Samuel Freeman, Winla Marie Heinehan and Jenny Louisa Henriksen, Alma Paulson and her 4 children, Herbert Cave, William Denton Cox, John Law Hume, Sidney Leslie Goodwin, and the real J Dawson. What started as a journey to learn about Leonardo DiCaprio's character name twin became so much more. So many stories, each hitting your heart, and some making you want to cry. Each tombstone is not just a number and a shared date of death, but it was a person, a name, and a story, many of whom I found myself wanting to do more research and learn more about. And the ones who are unknown, with no name noted, and just the date of death and their number, they too were people with stories. You can search online and see what details are known about some of them, such as an estimated age or nationality, if they had tattoos or birthmarks, or what they were wearing when their body was recovered. I found that the more I learned, the more I wanted to keep learning, and the more I wanted to understand each of their stories and share it with the world. There have been requests as recent as 2019 to exhume the unknown recovered victims to try and use modern science and DNA to identify them. But the requests have been denied, leaving these victims to remain a mystery to all those who visit the Titanic cemeteries in Halifax, Nova Scotia. On my next episode, on a second part of a special on remembering the 108th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, I'll be talking about having brunch inside the rebuilt first-class lounge of Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. Please subscribe to my podcast, Backpacker Flip-Flops, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review and tell a friend. For each subscriber and 5-star review received this month, $1 will be donated to the Boston Public Library. You can connect with me on my website, backpackerflipflops.com, or follow me on Instagram at backpackerflipflops. Pictures from the Fairview Lawn Cemetery are available on my Instagram page. Thanks so much for listening. Till next time, ciao, adios, auf Wiedersehen, bye.